Schweinfurt, Germany, October 1943. The sky above the ball-bearing factories was black with flak, not the scattered bursts that you could dodge, but the concentrated box barrages that filled entire sectors of airspace with shrapnel and concussion waves that could tear an aircraft apart without actually hitting it directly. Inside the ball turret of a B-17 designated Memphis Belle II, Staff Sergeant Anthony Russo hung suspended in a plexiglass sphere beneath the bomber's belly, surrounded by machinery and ammunition and nothing but a quarter-inch of transparent plastic between him and 30,000 feet of empty air, watching German fighters assemble for their attack, run with the methodical precision of wolves, circling wounded prey. The intercom crackled with the voices of other gunners calling out fighter positions, the pilot acknowledging and making small adjustments to give everyone clear fields of fire, the bombardier counting down seconds to release over the target that they had already lost 14 bombers to reach and would lose more leaving. Russo's hands rested on the twin 50 caliber machine guns that were his only weapons and his only purpose. Electrically powered turret that could rotate 360 degrees and elevate from straight down to almost straight up, giving him coverage of the entire lower hemisphere of the bomber's defensive envelope. And he tracked the German fighters as they positioned themselves for their attack, watching their movement patterns and their spacing and the way they were coordinating for a synchronized strike from multiple angles that would overwhelm the defensive fire and give them clean shots at engines and cockpit and bomb bay. But Russo wasn't just watching them with his eyes, he was feeling them in a way that he couldn't explain and had stopped trying to explain after the first dozen times people looked at him like he was crazy. A sensation that he had first noticed during his third combat mission and had learned to trust absolutely by his 10th, a kind of pressure or tension or wrongness that told him when incoming fire was going to pass near his position, not close enough to see, but close enough to matter, close enough that he needed to move or adjust or signal the pilot to take evasive action. Other gunners tracked targets visually and fired at what they could see and hoped they hit something, calculating lead angles and deflection based on training and experience and the instinctive geometry that good gunners developed after enough time behind the guns. Russo did all of that too, but he also felt the incoming fire, felt it the way you feel. Someone staring at you from across a room, felt it in his gut and his skin and some part of his nervous system that didn't have a name, and that feeling had kept him alive through 23 combat missions over the most heavily defended targets in Germany, when the average life expectancy for a ball turret gunner was somewhere around 8 missions. Right now, that feeling was screaming at him, telling him that something was wrong with the fighter formation he was watching, that they weren't setting up for a standard attack but for something else, something coordinated and dangerous that was going to come from a direction nobody was watching. Russo keyed his intercom and said, "Skipper, we got something weird developing. Fighters at 4 o'clock low are positioning wrong. Looks like they're setting up for a belly attack coordinated with the high group." And the pilot, Major Frank Morrison, who had flown 41 missions and trusted Russo's instincts more than he trusted his own instruments, said, "What do you need?" And Russo said, "Drop us 200 feet and drift right. Make it look like we're falling out of formation. Give me angles on the belly attack." And Morrison didn't hesitate, just pushed the yoke forward and eased right. and the WWII dropped below the formation box like it had been hit. And 3 seconds later, the space where they had been was filled with 20-millimeter cannon fire from fighters that had come up from below in a climbing attack, timed to catch them exactly where they should have been. And Russo was already firing, leading the fighters through their climb and walking his tracers into the lead FW-190 that exploded in a spectacular fireball that tumbled through the formation trailing burning debris. The other fighters broke off, their coordination destroyed by the unexpected movement and the loss of their lead, and Morrison hauled the B-17 back up into formation while the rest of the group poured fire into the scattering Germans. And then they were past the target and heading west with the bomb bay empty and engines all running and only minor damage from flak, which qualified as a successful mission by the standards of late 1943, when successful meant you came back at all. After they landed at their base in England, Morrison climbed out of the cockpit and walked back to where Russo was extracting himself from the ball turret with the stiff movements of someone who had been folded into a space barely large enough to contain a human body for 5 hours straight. And Morrison said, "How did you know?" And Russo said, "I felt them setting it up, felt the timing was wrong for a standard attack." And Morrison said, "You felt them," not making it a question, but not making it a statement either, just acknowledging something that he didn't understand, but had learned to accept because it kept working. And Russo shrugged and said, "Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but yeah." And Morrison said, "Crazy is fine as long as it keeps working," and walked away to file his mission report. Anthony Russo had grown up in South Boston, in a neighborhood where Irish and Italian families lived in uneasy proximity and settled their disputes with fists and rocks and occasionally knives, where you learned to sense trouble before it arrived, or you didn't survive childhood intact. His father worked on the docks, loading and unloading ships 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and his mother took in sewing and raised 5 children in a 4th-floor walk-up that was always too hot in summer and too cold in winter. Russo was the second son, quieter than his older brother, but tougher than he looked, and he had discovered early that he could sense violence before it happened, could feel when someone was about to throw a punch or pull a knife, or when a situation was about to turn bad. Some combination of body language and tension and environmental cues that his brain processed faster than conscious thought. He didn't think of it as anything special, assumed everyone could do it. But by the time he was 12, he had realized that other kids got surprised by violence, while he was never surprised, was always ready. And that difference had kept him out of the hospital more times than he could count. When he was 16, he had been walking home from work at a grocery store where he stocked shelves for 30 cents an hour, when he felt the wrongness, that particular pressure that meant danger was nearby and closing in. He had stopped walking, looked around, seen nothing unusual, but the feeling persisted and intensified. And he had stepped into a doorway, just as a car came around the corner too fast, mounted the sidewalk exactly where he had been walking, and crashed into a lamppost. The driver had been drunk, had lost control, would have killed Russo if Russo had been standing where he was supposed to be. After that incident, Russo started paying more attention to the feeling, started trying to understand what triggered it and what it meant. And he realized that it wasn't just about violence or danger, but about trajectories and timing and the convergence of moving objects in space, that he could sense when things were going to intersect his position, even when he couldn't see them coming. It was like having a radar in his head, some part of his brain that calculated ballistics and relative motion and probability clouds, and translated all of that into a simple gut feeling that said, move or duck or wrong direction. When the war came and Russo enlisted in the Army Air Corps in early 1942, the recruiters had tested him for various positions and found that he had exceptional spatial awareness and reaction time and hand-eye coordination, and they had sent him to gunnery school, where he learned to operate the various defensive weapons on bombers and fighters. The training was straightforward, teaching the mechanical operation of the guns and the basic principles of deflection shooting and the teamwork required to coordinate defensive fire from multiple positions. But Russo found that he didn't need most of the deflection training because he could feel where the target was going to be, could sense the convergence point where his bullets and the enemy aircraft would occupy the same space at the same time. His instructors noticed that he rarely missed, that his accuracy rate was more than double the average for gunnery students, and they marked him down as a natural gunner and assigned him to the ball turret, which was the most demanding and most dangerous gunner position on a B-17, requiring constant vigilance and split-second decisions and the physical ability to operate in a space so confined that many men couldn't psychologically handle it. Russo discovered that he loved the ball turret, loved the 360-degree visibility, and the sense of being suspended in space with nothing around him but sky and clouds and the enemy fighters that were trying to kill him. The confined space didn't bother him because he had grown up in cramped apartments and had learned to be comfortable in tight places. And the isolation didn't bother him because he had always been comfortable alone with his thoughts. What he loved most was that the ball turret position let him use his sense fully, let him track multiple threats simultaneously, and feel the patterns of attack developing, and respond to dangers that other gunners couldn't see yet. In his first 5 combat missions, he shot down 3 confirmed enemy fighters and damaged 2 others, which was an exceptional record for a gunner. And by his 10th mission, the other crews were requesting him specifically because word had gotten around that Russo could sense attacks before they happened, and his bomber had never been seriously damaged by fighters. The phenomenon became more pronounced as he flew more missions, as if the repeated exposure to combat was sharpening the sense or teaching his brain to interpret the signals more clearly. By his 15th mission, Russo could feel enemy fighters positioning for attacks when they were still miles away and out of visual range, could sense the buildups of flak before the first shells burst, could tell when another bomber in the formation was going to be hit seconds before the actual impact. He started calling out warnings to his pilot, saying things like, "Flak coming heavy at 12 o'clock, altitude exact, 30 seconds before the first shells arrived," or fighters setting up for coordinated attack from 5 and 7 o'clock high, when the fighters were still tiny dots that nobody else had identified as threats, and his warnings were accurate often enough that Morrison started maneuvering the bomber based on what Russo was feeling rather than what anyone was seeing, and their survival rate improved dramatically. Other gunners in the squadron started asking Russo how he did it, how he knew things before they happened, And Russo tried to explain but couldn't find words that made sense. Couldn't describe the sensation of feeling trajectories and convergence points and danger vectors in a way that other people could understand or replicate. He tried teaching a few of the other ball turret gunners to pay attention to subtle cues and trust their instincts and think in terms of geometry and relative motion. And some of them improved their performance marginally, but none of them could do what Russo did. None of them could feel the attacks coming from beyond visual range or sense the exact moment when evasive action was needed. The ability was unique to Russo, some combination of innate neural architecture and childhood training and combat experience that couldn't be transferred or taught. And eventually, people stopped asking how he did it and just accepted that Russo knew things and that listening to Russo was a good way to stay alive. The mission over Schweinfurt in October 1943 was the mission that made Russo's reputation spread beyond his own squadron, because the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers that day, the highest single-day loss of the war up to that point. And the losses would have been even worse, except that Russo, flying in the lead bomber of the low squadron, had called out warnings that saved not just his own aircraft, but 7 other bombers in his formation that followed Morrison's evasive maneuvers. After that mission, the group commander, Colonel Patrick Hayes, called Russo into his office and asked him to explain exactly what he was doing and how he was doing it. And Russo tried to explain about sensing trajectories and feeling danger and knowing when attacks were developing. And Hayes listened without interrupting and then said, "Sergeant, I don't understand what you're describing, and I'm not sure I believe it's possible, but I can't argue with results, so I'm going to make you lead ball turret gunner and put you in the lead bomber for every mission where you're available. And I want you to call out every warning you can give us. I don't care if it sounds crazy or turns out to be wrong. I want you talking constantly. Understood?" And Russo said, "Yes, sir." And that was how he ended up flying in the lead bomber for the next 37 missions, providing tactical warnings that the formation leaders used to adjust their routes and altitudes and defensive positions. The impact was measurable and significant, because the formations that Russo flew with had a loss rate of 4.3% per mission compared to the average loss rate of 7.8% for formations without him. And over the course of 50 missions, that difference translated to dozens of aircraft saved and hundreds of lives preserved. The 8th Air Force Operations Research people noticed the statistical anomaly and sent a team to interview Russo and try to understand what he was doing. And they spent 3 days questioning him and testing his reactions and trying to develop a training protocol that could replicate his abilities. And at the end of 3 days, they concluded that Russo possessed what they called exceptional predictive threat assessment capability that appeared to be based on unconscious processing of environmental cues and trajectory calculations that his brain performed faster than conscious awareness. They recommended that similar personnel be identified during gunnery training and assigned to key defensive positions, but they also noted that it was extremely rare and that attempts to train it in people who didn't naturally possess it had shown minimal results. The Air Force did implement screening during gunnery training, adding tests that measured spatial awareness and predictive ability and unconscious threat assessment. And they identified about 30 other gunners, across the entire 8th Air Force who showed some degree of the capability that Russo had, though none of them showed it to the same degree. Those gunners were tracked and assigned to lead bomber positions, and their effectiveness was monitored, and the data showed that formations with predictive gunners had consistently lower loss rates than formations without them, validating the concept even if they couldn't explain the mechanism. The program was classified and never publicly acknowledged, filed away in operational research reports that wouldn't be declassified for 40 years, but it saved lives and influenced tactical decisions and became one of the many small innovations that collectively improved the survival rate of bomber crews and contributed to the eventual air superiority that enabled the Allied victory in Europe. Russo himself flew 53 combat missions, which was far beyond the standard tour of 25 missions that was supposed to be the maximum anyone flew. But he kept volunteering for additional missions because he felt responsible for the other crews who had come to depend on his warnings. And by early 1944, he had become something of a legend in the 8th Air Force, the ball turret gunner, who could sense attacks before they happened, and had the highest survival rate of any gunner in the theater. He was promoted to technical sergeant and then to master sergeant, and he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with 11 oak leaf clusters, and generals who visited the base asked to meet him and shook his hand and asked him how he did what he did. And Russo gave them the same answer he gave everyone, that he just felt things and trusted what he felt, and that he couldn't really explain it better than that. In March 1944, after his 53rd mission, Russo was finally grounded by the flight surgeon, who said that 53 missions was enough, and that Russo had done his part and needed to go home before his luck ran out, because luck always ran out eventually, and the odds caught up with everyone in the end. Russo was sent back to the States and assigned to Gunnery Training Command, where he spent the rest of the war trying to teach other gunners to develop the kind of threat awareness that had kept him alive. And he had limited success because most people couldn't feel what he felt and couldn't learn to trust instincts they didn't have. But some students did show improvement, did learn to pay more attention to subtle cues and to trust their gut feelings and to think in terms of trajectories and convergence. And Russo's teaching methods were incorporated into the advanced gunnery curriculum and became part of the training that all gunners received, even if most of them never developed the full capability that Russo possessed. After the war ended, Russo went back to Boston and used the GI Bill to go to college, studying engineering at Northeastern University, and graduating in 1949 with a degree in mechanical engineering. He worked for General Electric for 35 years, designing guidance systems and fire control computers, and eventually working on early missile defense systems that used radar and computers to predict incoming missile trajectories and calculate intercept solutions. And he found the work fascinating because it was essentially mechanizing the same kind of trajectory prediction that his brain did unconsciously, turning intuition into algorithms and sensors into artificial instincts. He retired in 1984 and spent his retirement years sailing on Cape Cod Bay, teaching his grandchildren to sail and to trust their instincts and to pay attention to things that most people didn't notice. And he died in 2003 at the age of 80, leaving behind a wife and 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and a legacy that most of them didn't fully understand, because he had never talked much about the war, or about what he had done, or about the ability that had made him exceptional. His obituary in the Boston Globe mentioned his military service, and his career at General Electric, and his love of sailing, but it didn't mention the 53 missions, or the 37 bombers he had helped save, or the predictive threat assessment program that had been built around his capabilities. But in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, archives at Maxwell Air Force Base, there's a classified operations research report from 1944 titled Enhanced Threat Prediction in Defensive Gunnery Operations. And that report describes Russo's capabilities in detail and includes statistical analysis showing the correlation between his presence in a formation and reduced loss rates. And it recommends continued research into the neurological and cognitive basis of predictive threat assessment with the goal of developing screening tools and training protocols. The report was declassified in 1984, the same year Russo retired from GE, and it was read by a handful of researchers studying the history of air combat tactics, and one of those researchers tracked Russo down and interviewed him for an oral history project. And Russo told the story of how he had felt bullets coming and had trusted that feeling and had tried to explain it to people who mostly didn't understand but who listened anyway because it kept working. The researcher asked Russo if he thought the ability was something that could be trained or if it was something you had to be born with. And Russo thought about it for a long time and then said that it was probably both, that some people had more natural aptitude for it, but that everyone could improve their threat awareness if they practiced and paid attention and learned to trust their instincts. He said that the modern world was making people worse at it, not better, because people were surrounded by so much artificial stimulation and so many safety systems that they never developed the kind of situational awareness that humans used to have when survival depended on noticing subtle cues and predicting dangers before they materialized. He said that evolution had given humans sophisticated threat prediction capabilities because the humans who couldn't predict threats didn't survive long enough to pass on their genes. But that modern society had made those capabilities optional, and most people had let them atrophy. And that was dangerous because safety systems could fail, and artificial intelligence could malfunction, and sometimes you needed to rely on your own instincts to stay alive. The researcher asked if Russo had ever been wrong, if his instincts had ever failed him, and Russo said yes, that he had been wrong a few times, had called for evasive maneuvers that turned out to be unnecessary, or had predicted attacks that didn't materialize, but that being wrong occasionally was better than ignoring the warnings and being dead. He said that instinct wasn't infallible, but it was usually better than nothing, and that the key was to calibrate your confidence based on the strength of the signal, to distinguish between strong warnings that demanded immediate action and weak warnings that just suggested increased vigilance. He said that a lot of people ignored their instincts because they were afraid of looking foolish or being wrong, and that fear of embarrassment killed more people than actual failures of instinct. Because if you waited until you were certain you waited too long, and by then it was too late to save yourself. The interview was transcribed and filed in the oral history collection at the Air Force Museum, and it sits there along with thousands of other interviews with veterans. And occasionally a researcher or a student finds it and reads it and wonders about this man who could feel bullets coming and who tried to explain something that couldn't really be explained in words. The interview includes a section where Russo talks about the ball turret, about what it was like to hang suspended beneath a bomber at 30,000 feet with nothing but plexiglass between you and the ground. And he says that a lot of people thought the ball turret was terrifying, but that he had found it peaceful, that it gave him a kind of clarity and focus that he never experienced anywhere else, that when he was in the turret, everything else fell away, and there was just him and the sky and the threats that he could feel developing, and that in those moments he felt more alive and more capable than at any other time in his life. He says that after the war, he missed that feeling, missed the clarity and the focus and the sense of purpose that came from defending his crew and his aircraft against enemies who were trying to kill them, and that nothing in civilian life ever replicated that intensity or that sense of mattering, and that he thought a lot of veterans felt the same way, even if they didn't talk about it. The ball turret itself, the actual physical turret that Russo used during his 53 missions, was salvaged from Memphis Belle II when the aircraft was scrapped in 1946, and it was eventually donated to a museum in Massachusetts, where it sits in a corner of a World War II exhibit. And the placard next to it explains that the ball turret was one of the most dangerous positions on a bomber, and that the men who manned them showed exceptional courage and skill. The placard doesn't mention Anthony Russo, or the Predictive Threat Assessment Program, or the 37 bombers that were saved by his warnings, because the museum doesn't have that information and wouldn't know how to explain it if they did, because the story is too strange and too specific and too dependent on accepting that some people can sense things that shouldn't be sensible. But the turret is there, a piece of machinery that once held a man who could feel death coming and who saved lives by trusting something that couldn't be measured or explained. And occasionally a visitor will look at it and wonder what it was like to sit in that sphere of plexiglass and steel and face enemy fighters and flak and the vast emptiness of the sky. The broader lesson from Russo's story is about the nature of human capability and the limits of mechanization, about the things that humans can do that machines still cannot replicate despite decades of advancing technology. Modern aircraft have sophisticated threat warning systems, radar, and infrared sensors and signal processing algorithms that can detect incoming missiles and hostile aircraft and calculate optimal defensive responses. And those systems are faster and more reliable than human senses and human instincts. But they're also brittle, dependent on functioning sensors and power supplies and software that works correctly. And when those systems fail, the human operators need to fall back on their own senses and their own judgment. And if they haven't maintained those capabilities, they're helpless. The military understands this and continues to train pilots and crews in basic skills that don't depend on technology, continues to emphasize situational awareness and threat assessment and the development of instincts that can supplement or substitute for technological systems when necessary. Russo's ability was exceptional, probably beyond what most people could achieve, even with extensive training. But the underlying capability to assess threats and predict trajectories and make rapid decisions based on incomplete information is something that all humans possess to some degree, and that can be developed through practice and attention. The modern Air Force still includes threat awareness training in its curriculum, teaching pilots and crews to maintain situational awareness and to trust their instincts, and to use all available information sources, including their own senses and intuitions. They don't talk about feeling bullets coming or sensing attacks before they're visible, because that sounds too mystical and too unreliable, but they teach the same underlying skills that Russo used, the same attention to environmental cues and pattern recognition and predictive thinking that kept him alive through 53 missions over Germany. There's a moment in the interview transcript where the researcher asks Russo what he would tell young people today, what lessons from his experience might apply to modern life. And Russo thinks about it and then says that the most important thing is to pay attention, to notice what's happening around you, and to trust yourself when something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate why. He says that instincts are the product of millions of years of evolution, of countless generations of humans who survived because they could sense danger and predict threats and take action before it was too late, and that those instincts are still there in everyone, but they need to be cultivated and trusted and used, or they atrophy and disappear. He says that modern life is full of distractions and artificial stimulations that dull our senses and make us less aware of our environment, and that people need to deliberately practice awareness and attention and trust their gut feelings when something seems wrong. He says it's not about being paranoid or seeing threats everywhere. It's about being appropriately cautious and maintaining the kind of situational awareness that humans used to have naturally, but now have to consciously develop. The interview ends with Russo being asked if he's proud of what he did during the war. And there's a long pause in the transcript, several seconds of silence, and then Russo says that pride isn't the right word, that he did what needed doing, and he was glad he could help, and he was grateful to have survived when so many others didn't, but that mostly he just feels lucky. Lucky that he had the ability he had, and lucky that people listened to him, and lucky that he got to come home when the war ended and build a life and raise a family. He says the real heroes were the pilots who kept flying even when they were terrified, and the gunners who went up mission after mission knowing the odds were against them, and the ground crews who kept the aircraft flying against impossible maintenance challenges, and that his contribution was just one small part of a vast collective effort that involved millions of people all doing their jobs as well as they could. The interviewer thanks him, and the recording ends, and that's the last extensive documentation of Anthony Russo's wartime experiences, preserved in an archive that most people don't know exists and will probably never access. But the legacy persists in the training programs and the tactical doctrines and the institutional knowledge that the Air Force maintains about threat assessment and situational awareness and the importance of human judgment in situations where technology alone is insufficient. Every pilot who learns to maintain situational awareness, every gunner who learns to trust their instincts, every sensor operator who learns to supplement their instruments with their own observations, is carrying forward something that traces back through decades of experience and innovation and hard-won lessons to people like Anthony Russo, who figured out how to survive in situations that should have been unsurvivable, and who shared what they learned with others, who used it to survive their own impossible situations. That's how knowledge propagates through military organizations and maybe through all human institutions, not through formal documentation and official channels alone, but through the teaching and mentoring and example setting that happens between people who've done the job and people who are learning to do it, through the stories that get told and the techniques that get passed down and the hard-won wisdom that accumulates over generations of practice. Anthony Russo is mostly forgotten now, remembered by his family and by a few military historians who specialize in obscure aspects of World War II air combat, but his influence persists in ways that can't be easily traced or measured in training programs and tactical concepts and the collective expertise of an organization that learned from his example and incorporated his insights into its institutional knowledge. That's a kind of immortality. Not the famous kind, but perhaps the more meaningful kind. The kind that continues to save lives and solve problems long after the individual is gone. The kind that proves that what matters isn't whether history remembers your name, but whether your contributions made things better for the people who came after you.